we had a terrible attack in this country on 9/11, and nearly 3,000 Americans were killed. And in response, we launched this thing called a war on terror. And we were told that it would make us safer and that we would vanquish terrorism. Well, it's been a long time since then, 13 years. How are we doing? Have we vanquished terrorism? Well, let's take a look at a story out of Reuters here. The number of people killed in militant attacks worldwide jumped more than 60% last year to a record high of nearly 18,000 people killed in just 1 year. Now, this study is a little controversial because of how they define terrorism, but they define it narrowly, okay? So if you included all the deaths in Syria, then the number would be much, much larger. Now, but they view that as mainly standard combat with an army against rebel fighters, etc. Now, there is some case of terrorism in Syria, a lot of that as well. That's when they target civilians and they're not in uniform, etc. Right? So it's actually a conservative number that you're looking at. All right. They explain that 4 Islamist groups operating in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria were responsible for 2/3 of the 2013 attacks, and the vast majority of the deaths occurred in those countries. Okay, wait, I thought we'd liberated Iraq. I thought that when we invaded Iraq as part of our war on terror, Dick Cheney said we would be going to the geographic area from which terrorism rises. So that when we defeated that, things would get better. You want to know which country's #1 in terrorism-related deaths this year? Encapsulating more than 1/3 of all terrorism-related deaths for the entire globe. Not Afghanistan, which we're in the middle of a war with, not Syria, not Nigeria, not Pakistan. Yes, the answer is Iraq. What happened? I thought we were going to solve terrorism. Reuters explains, however, militant attacks are on the rise more broadly, with 24 countries seeing more than 50 deaths in 2013. So don't worry, it's not just those 4 or 5 countries. Hey, it's in dozens of countries where a lot of people are dying. How's that war on terror working out for us? Deaths in such attacks are now 5 times higher than in 2000. So let me get this right. In 2001, we launched the war on terror. 13 years later, the number of terrorist deaths related to terrorism is up 5-fold. This reminds me of a scene from Jeremy Scahill's movie Dirty Wars, where he was talking to one of the guys from Special Forces who was in Iraq, and he said, we were chasing those 50, 55 guys that were on the deck of cards. Remember when we first invaded Iraq, the top generals for Saddam Hussein, etc. And we started with a list that was in the ballpark of about 55 actually. And then as we kept doing the raids, the list would increase, and then we had 200 people on the list. And then as we were trying to get to 200, which we thought, well, that's doable, we might be able to find most of those guys. Well, we would kill so many people and they would fire back, and the war grew and grew and grew. Eventually the list became 3,000 people. You see, the list never goes down. The list only goes up. We go kill them, they go kill us, and the circle of violence gets larger and larger and larger. It never gets smaller. So when they told you the war on terror was to make sure that we didn't have more terrorism, at best they were wrong. In a worst case scenario, they were lying, and they knew it. Well, look, the one thing that did not go down is the stock price of defense contractors and companies like Halliburton, which greatly profited from the war in Iraq. In fact, during the war in Iraq, their stock price, because of mainly of their subsidiary KBR, which is so much private contract work for the Defense Department in Iraq, went up 5-fold. That's interesting. You see that? Terrorism goes up 5-fold, and so does Halliburton's stock price. So some people won out of this, but if you think we got less terrorism because of our war on terror, well, you are factually incorrect. And here's another example of how the circle of violence continues. Reuters explains, increased targeting of police by the militant groups makes managing the problem even harder, sometimes fueling rights abuses that compound existing grievances. Okay, so what that's saying is the cops go after the terrorists then go after the cops get angry, they go after their so-called terrorists, but in the meanwhile they torture, they do human rights abuses, and then that makes everybody angry, and oftentimes they get innocent people, that makes even more people angry, that makes more people attack the police, and round we go. And then finally, how does this get resolved, if it ever gets resolved? Well, it turns out in some cases it has gotten resolved. So let's go to those cases and see how it worked. The report showed some 80% of the militant groups, which had ceased their activity since 2000, did so following negotiations. Only 10% achieved their goals, while 7% were eliminated by military action. 7% success rate. Job well done. So those guys who say, let's bomb them, and let's bomb them even more. Those are the knuckleheads who'd like to succeed 7% of the time. Now, were there military actions that then led to negotiations? Sure. But in the end, you have to negotiate. That is how you get success 80% of the time. So the people who are for endless war are wrong. And the people who say at some point we should talk to our enemies, because that's the only way to resolve it, are again factually correct. So you can make any argument you like, you can get angry if you want, you could yell and scream and demand more blood. That's fine, but it's not going to change the facts.